the memoristic memory, until the memoristic engine, which are these large-scale distributed processor with integrated memoristic based memory, is actually built, what we are actually doing is to simulate, is to use a different form of engines, which in this case are multi-core CPUs and GPUs, and we're going to swap in basically the memoristic engine as soon as they are developed. The basic atomic operation in the cog ex machina is called the linear transformation and the nonlinear transformation. So you can think as the linear transformation as a massive multiplication between incoming synaptic weights, incoming activation, sorry, of the previous cortical subcortical layer of cell activity and the synaptic weight between presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron. And the nonlinear transformation is instead pertaining the cell dynamics of the postsynaptic neuron. So it basically takes the input given by the linear transformation, performs the somatic operation, and then feeds that forward to the next neural stage, and also provides some feedback in order to guide learning. So our task was to survey the learning literature and to come up with a list of learning laws that would satisfy the hardware constraints. And by saying so, we need to choose learning laws whose computational load was appropriate for the particular hardware that we are using. Also, we want learning laws that are local, both in time and space. So the information that guides learning has to be present at the same time and in the same spot where learning is computed. And also, which part of this learning law can be handled by the linear component of the somatic part of our computation and the nonlinear one, and the linear one. Importantly, in order for the learning laws to exploit the hardware to its fullest extent, 99% of the computation, or the majority of it, has to be performed in the memoristic engine or the linear transformation. So this is an example of a list of the learning laws we are currently looking at. This is a partial list. We'll be looking at Hebb rule derivatives, or more biologically inspired rules, threshold rule variation, import reconstruction, rule variation, temporal difference, and these are the main macro classes that we are looking currently at. This is an example of the general form equation, kind of an older version, but the idea here is fairly simple. There are in order to implement each particular learning law, we initialize each one of these three different subfunctions to a particular values, and by doing so, we're able to swap in different learning laws. We are of course interested in mathematically describe these laws, but we are even more interested in testing how this learning law can give us the plasticity that is necessary in order to self-organize aspect of the animal intelligence. And if you look across the neuroscience literature for example of neuroplasticity, perhaps the least controversial example pertains the orientation of the development of ocular dominance and orientation sensitivity in the early stages of the visual cortical areas in the cat. And the idea here is that when you record from the visual cortex of the cat, you find many papers tend to produce maps that look like this, and they're a little difficult to understand, and here is a visual aid for you. If you record from patches of the visual cortical areas from these groups of contiguous cells, you will find that they tend to be responsive to stimuli of a particular orientation. And if you record from these elongated patches, you will find that the cells tend to be responsive to one or the other input I in a prevalent way. So the idea here was to test whether some of these learning laws can be used in order to reproduce some basic visual plasticity examples by also respecting the constraints of the hardware. These are the experimental settings. So we start from a set of natural images which are fed to an artificial visual system consisting of two retinas connected to a thalamic nucleus or a subcortical nucleus, which is itself split in 4 different nuclei, which then feeds to a simulated cortical areas where the map that I just showed you is supposed to develop. So all connections, the connection between the retina and the thalamus are fixed, whereas the connection between the lateral geniculate nucleus and the cortex and within the cortex are plastic and allowed to change. So we are in the process of testing several of these learning laws. We also want to assess what kind of results we get with these experiments, so whether the plasticity that we employed actually help us to achieve replication of some important experimental data. So we are looking in particular at a representation of the input feature distribution. So by if we present natural images which are fairly varied in their input statistic, we expect that also the resulting map will tend to be well behaved, in the sense that cells that you record from the new cortex will tend to express a variety of different orientation. And this is contrasted with the example in which you present only, for instance, stimuli that have a particular very strong prevalent orientation, say a vertical one, in which case you will expect that the resulting cell will also tend to express mostly that orientation. As a consequence of learning, also you expect an increase in orientation tuning, so the strength of each cell's tuning to a particular orientation should increase as a function of learning. Also, you would expect, very importantly, learning stability. So, as you unleash learning in a system to freely learn in an environment, you don't want all synaptic weights to either go to zero or to exceed or go to saturation. And also, you will expect some qualitative measures in terms, for instance, of clustering and periodicity. So these are some of the results that we have obtained, in particular in terms of orientation maps. We, as a function of learning, we observe an increase in clustering periodicity. Also, as a function of learning, we reduce the number of cells that tend to have a weak orientation tuning, and an increase in the number of cells that have a strong orientation tuning. And also, if you start from a random distribution of orientation, if we present natural images which has a large repertoire of different orientation, we also expect that the resulting map will tend to express this variety of orientation. That's exactly what we obtain. In terms of ocular dominance map, we observe again an increase in clustering and periodicity as a function of learning. Ocular tuning, if we start from a situation in which most of the cells have a weak preference for one particular eye, as a consequence of learning, we have a wider distribution, so some of the cells tend to become strongly responsive to a particular eye input. And also input distribution, if we start from cells that are initially binocular, prior to learning, as a consequence of learning, we have still some of the cells which respond to both eyes, but also they tend to respond to one particular stimulation eye. One thing that we are interested in testing is the stability of learning. So how do synaptic weights evolve as a function of learning? So this plot represents the sum of the synaptic weights of a particular cell, so all the incoming projections. And as you go and present thousands of different images, you can notice that the weights tend to stay fairly stable. And this is, of course, not the case with all learning laws. So if we plug in, for instance, another learning laws, which is a pure Hebbian law, which is a simple correlation between presynaptic and postsynaptic activity, you can notice that the activity of neurons tend to grow without bound. One thing that we notice, though, is that by presenting thousands of different images, the map in terms of clustering and periodicity in developing cortex tends to shift. And this is an important fact which can create eventually instability if you unleash learning in an unsupervised way in a freely behaving agent. And we have a project that I'm going to touch briefly about it, which tries to tackle this issue. We are, of course, interested in stability of representation, but also in plasticity. And one of the reasons why we're interested in this is that if you think about thrilling behavior agents that can be deployed in different, for instance, visual environment, that you want these particular agents to develop well-behaved receptive field that will tend to maximize the information extracted by the agent in each particular environment um, they are exposed to without the need of human intervention in retraining the system. And this is, of course, not only true for low-level representation, but also for high-level representation, in the sense that you want to restructure, for instance, categorization of objects, plans, etc. Another interesting aspect of embedding plasticity online for instance, in robotic platform, is the idea of loss of a sensor. So if you lose a sensor in a robotic platform, chances are, if you don't pre-program it explicitly, that the hardware real estate that is dedicated to the elaboration of a particular sensor is actually lost. Cortical plasticity in vivo does actually not suffer from this drawback. In particular, if you cut a sensor to if you cut a sensor to a human being or to an animal, the cortical areas which receive input from that particular lesioned sensor, they tend to reorganize, and the surviving senses gradually take over the cortical real estate that was previously devoted to the lost sense. And this is exactly what you find also in our simulations. If you start from a situation in which both input eyes are open, you will see that some of the cells respond binocularly, but some of them respond. You have a fairly well-behaved distribution of ocular sensitivity, as opposed to the case in which you close one eye and you simulate the loss of a sensor, in which all the cells tend to code for the surviving sensor. We are interested in learning, but we are also interested again in plasticity and instability. Instability is also called in various other names. It's called homeostasis or synaptic scaling. And the idea here is that there are several experimental results that shows that neurons have the ability to self-stabilize their activity in response to variation of the overall activity coming to them. So if a neuron has a lot of activity or a drop in activity, it is able through homeostasis to achieve a consistent average level of activity. So what we try to do in our simulation is to study how plasticity and homeostasis work together to both achieve two goals at one. On the one hand, to self-organize or extract meaningful features in an environment, and at the same time maintain equilibrium in a particular network, in the sense that neither the activation of the network goes to 0 to infinity, nor the synaptic weight follow the same fate. And here the goal is to study the function. So we are interested in how to use this principle in order to learn something meaningful for the organism. This is the setup of this particular simulation that we have performed. The idea here is to start from a set of natural images which are passed to a non-center of surround architecture and then fed to the next layer. We then simulate many of these instances in which we sample random patches from the visual field, and we then feed this information to simulated cortical areas, which consist of an on-center of surround architecture, where the excitation and inhibition is actually scaled by a set of other differential equations that defines these homeostatic mechanisms that tend to preserve the overall level of activity in the cell. And of course, what we add to this system is plasticity, so the ability of the cortical cells to learn a meaningful representation from their input. These are some of the results that we obtain. In particular, this plot shows the receptive field of one of these cortical cells as it learns thousands of different images. You can see that the receptive field here at the bottom tends to maintain a fairly constant structure despite thousands of different images are presented, and despite the network is blasted with a lot of activity in terms of here of a ramp up, a ramp down, and an unconstrained burst of excitatory and inhibitory input. The receptive field tend to maintain a fairly robust a fairly robust structures, and also the average activity of the network, apart from a few transients when